There's something about being alone in a house that makes you notice every little sound. When you're surrounded by people, those creaks and groans of an old house blend into the background, barely registering in your mind. But when it's just you, those sounds become louder, more insistent, like the house itself is trying to get your attention. That's what I was thinking about the night it happened. I was 16, and my parents were out for the evening, leaving me home alone in our house at the edge of the woods. It wasn't the first time I'd been left by myself, but there was something different about that night. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I had my homework spread out on the kitchen table, but I wasn't really paying attention to it. The TV was on in the living room, casting a soft glow across the room, and I could hear the muffled sounds of a sitcom playing in the background. Outside, the sun had long since set, and the world beyond the windows was shrouded in darkness. Our house backed onto a dense forest, the trees pressing in close like silent sentinels. During the day, it was beautiful, a place where I could lose myself in nature, surrounded by the scent of pine and the rustle of leaves. But at night, those same trees took on a different character. They became a wall of blackness, a place where anything could be hiding, just out of sight. I wasn't scared, not really. I was used to the woods, used to the way they seemed to close in around the house at night. But as I sat there, my pen tapping idly against my notebook, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with a sound, a faint, distant noise that barely registered at first. I paused, my pen hovering over the paper, and listened. Nothing. Just the usual creaks of the house, the low hum of the refrigerator, the laugh track from the TV in the other room. I shrugged it off and went back to my homework, but a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was louder, more distinct. A voice. Faint, but unmistakable. And it was coming from the woods. I put down my pen, my heart skipping a beat as I strained to listen. The voice was distant, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but I could hear the urgency in it, the way it seemed to reach out, begging for someone to listen. Help. Please. Help. I frowned, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It didn't sound like anything out of the ordinary, just someone in trouble. But the woods were dense, thick with underbrush and uneven terrain. It wasn't a place you'd wander into by accident, especially not at night. I stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the backyard. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the trees, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just the same dark shapes of the forest, the same stillness that had always been there, but the voice didn't stop. Help! It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading, growing a little louder with each repetition. My first instinct was to run outside to see if someone needed help, but something held me back. There was something off about that voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was too faint, too distant, like it wasn't really coming from the woods at all, but from somewhere else entirely. Help. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I couldn't just ignore it. What if someone was really in trouble? But the more I listened, the more I felt that gnawing sense of unease, like something wasn't right. Finally, I made up my mind. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, my hand trembling slightly as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the backyard as I stepped outside. The night was cold, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But the voice had stopped. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting to hear it again. But the woods were silent. The only sound, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I should have gone back inside. I should have locked the door and forgotten about it. But something compelled me to move forward, to take a few tentative steps toward the edge of the woods. Help. The voice was louder now, closer, like it was coming from just beyond the tree line. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept moving, my flashlight casting long shadows across the ground. Who's there? I called out, my voice trembling slightly. For a moment, there was no response. And then the voice came again, clear and sharp. Help me, please. It was so close now, so real that I almost believed it. Almost. But there was something wrong with the way the voice echoed through the trees, something unnatural about the way it seemed to bounce off the trunks and come from every direction at once. I stopped, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I pointed it into the woods. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to go inside and lock the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. I stood there, frozen in place, the flashlight casting a jittery beam of light across the trees. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I was about to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the house when I heard a new sound. Rustling. In the bushes, just ahead. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, the beam illuminating the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the same dark shapes of the trees, the same tangle of underbrush. But then I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light, barely visible in the shadows. My heart lurched in my chest, and I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, so intense that I almost dropped the flashlight. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was it? What did they want? Why were they just standing there, hiding in the darkness? And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing where the voice had come from, but it hadn't moved. It had been there the whole time, which meant the voice hadn't been moving through the woods. It had been coming from that exact spot, as if the figure had been calling out to me. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was barely more than a silhouette, but there was something wrong with the way it was standing, the way its body seemed to blend into the shadows, like it wasn't entirely there. I knew I had to get out of there. I knew I had to turn around and run back to the house. But my legs felt like lead, my feet rooted to the ground as I stared at the figure, unable to look away. And then, slowly, the figure began to move. It stepped forward just enough to come into the light. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it clearly for the first time. It was a woman, or at least it had been at some point. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark, hollow pits. Her hair hung in matted strands around her face, and her clothes were tattered, clinging to her thin frame like rags. But it was her expression that terrified me the most. She was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across her face, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong on a human face, the kind of smile that sent a jolt of pure terror through my entire body. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and completely alien, she spoke. "Help me." I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just turned and ran. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand as I sprinted back toward the house, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the rustling behind me, the sound of something moving through the bushes, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the back door, fumbling with the handle as I threw it open and practically hurled myself inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands, and backed away, my eyes fixed on the darkness outside. For a moment I stood there, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The house was silent, the only sound the rapid thudding of my heart in my ears. But then I heard it again, the voice, right outside the door. "Help me, please." I backed away, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I had just seen her in the woods, just heard her calling out from the trees. How could she be here, so close, so fast? I grabbed the phone from the counter, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was a lifeline, a connection to the real world that I clung to desperately. "There's someone outside my house," I stammered, my voice barely steady. "I don't know who it is, but they're trying to get in. Please, send someone." The operator assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity as I waited, every second stretching out like hours. I could hear the voice still, calling out from just outside the door, but I refused to go near it, refused to look out the window. "Help me." The words were like a broken record, repeating over and over, each one sending a fresh wave of terror through me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The voice stopped abruptly, and I felt a momentary sense of relief. But when I looked out the window, the backyard was empty. The police arrived minutes later, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the area. I told them everything. about the voice, the figure in the woods, the way she had appeared so suddenly, so impossibly close to the house. They searched the woods, combing through every inch of the area, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. It was like she had never existed at all. The police stayed for a while, trying to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe me. Not really. They thought I had imagined it, that I had let my mind play tricks on me. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. After they left, I locked every door and window in the house, my hands still trembling. The fear hadn't left me. It was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, making me jump at every little sound. I kept expecting to hear the voice again, to hear it calling out from the darkness. But the night was silent. In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I told myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of the light, anything to make it seem less real. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew that something had been in those woods that night, something that wasn't supposed to be there, and I knew that it had been calling out to me. I've moved away from that house, away from those woods, but the fear never truly left me. It's a part of me now. I know that whatever was out there in those woods is still waiting for someone else to hear its call. It was one of those nights that makes you want to curl up with a good book and a cup of tea, the kind of night where the rain falls steadily against the windows, the thunder rumbles low in the distance, and the world outside feels far away. I'd always loved stormy weather, the way it made everything feel cozier, more intimate. But that night, there was something different in the air. I was home alone, my parents having gone out for the evening to celebrate their anniversary. It was just me and the old house that had been in our family for generations. I'd grown up there, so the sounds of the house were familiar to me, comforting even. But as the rain intensified and the wind picked up, the usual creaks and groans seemed louder, more insistent. I'd spent the earlier part of the evening in the living room, wrapped in a blanket and watching TV. But as the storm grew stronger, I decided to head upstairs to my room. The house was quiet, kind of deep. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand trailing along the wooden banister. The hallway was dark, the shadows cast by the flickering light bulbs dancing across the walls. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, listening to the wind howl outside before turning and heading toward my room. But just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it. A faint noise, barely audible over the sound of the storm. A soft, muffled thump, like something heavy being dropped onto the floor. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my heart skipping a beat. The noise had come from the basement. For a moment, I told myself I'd imagined it. The wind was playing tricks on me, rattling the windows and making the old house groan. But then I heard it again. Another soft thump, followed by a low, scraping sound like something being dragged across the floor. My stomach tightened with unease. I didn't want to go down there, didn't want to face whatever was making those sounds. But I knew I couldn't just ignore it either. I had to check it out, if only to convince myself that it was nothing. I turned away from my bedroom door and slowly made my way back down on the stairs, the old wood creaking under my weight. The noise continued, growing louder as I approached the basement door, a rhythmic, almost deliberate sound that set my nerves on edge. I reached the door, my hand trembling slightly as I wrapped my fingers around the cold brass knob. The basement was always cold, even in the summer, and the air that seeped through the crack under the door sent a shiver down my spine. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, the kind that made you feel like you were descending into another world. The light switch was at the top of the stairs, and I hesitated for a moment before flicking it on. The single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling buzzed to life, casting a dim, yellowish glow over the steps. I stood there for a moment, staring down into the darkness below, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound had stopped as soon as I opened the door, leaving only the low hum of the light bulb and the distant rumble of thunder outside. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a box had fallen over, or the wind had somehow made its way into the basement and knocked something loose. But the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. Slowly, I started down the stairs, the old wood creaking with each step. The basement smelled damp, a mix of mildew and dust that clung to the air. It was a large space, with stone walls and a low ceiling that made it feel even more confined. The floor was cluttered with old furniture, storage boxes, and other forgotten relics from the past, all covered in a fine layer of dust. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room, my eyes straining to see through the dim light. Everything seemed to be in its place. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that could have made those noises. But just as I was about to turn back, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind an old wardrobe, was a pile of blankets. At first, I thought nothing of it, just some old linens that had been thrown down there and forgotten. But then, as I stared at them, I realized something was wrong. The blankets were moving. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were definitely shifting, like something underneath them was trying to get out. My breath caught in my throat, my mind racing with possibilities. A rat? A raccoon that had somehow gotten inside? But as I stood there, frozen in place, the blankets suddenly shifted more violently, and I heard a soft, raspy breath. This wasn't an animal. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the moving blankets. This wasn't just some small animal, it was something much bigger, something that didn't belong in my basement. My mind raced with what to do. Should I call the police? My parents? But what would I tell them? That there was something under a pile of blankets in the basement? No, I had to know what it was first. I had to see it for myself. I took a tentative step forward, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I moved closer to the pile of blankets. The breathing grew louder, more labored, like whoever, or whatever, was under there was struggling to catch their breath. My hand shook as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the edge of the blanket. It was damp, cold to the touch, and I had to fight the urge to pull my hand back. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the blanket and yanked it away. What I saw beneath it made my blood run cold. A man was lying on the floor, curled up in a fetal position, his face hidden by his tangled hair. His clothes were filthy, torn and stained with something dark, and his skin was pale, almost gray, like he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. But it was his eyes that terrified me the most. They were wide open, bloodshot, and staring straight ahead, unblinking. There was a wildness in them, a look of pure, unbridled madness that made my stomach twist with fear. His chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me want to scream. And then, without warning, he lunged at me. I stumbled back, barely managing to dodge his outstretched hands as he clawed at the air, his mouth twisted into a snarl. He was fast, faster than I expected, and I barely had time to react before he was on his feet, staggering toward me with a crazed look in his eyes. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I bolted up the stairs. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and uneven, like he was struggling to keep up. But I didn't dare look back. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the basement door shut, locking it with trembling hands. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind racing with what to do next. I had to get out of the house. I had to call the police. But just as I turned to grab the phone, I heard a loud bang from the other side of the door. He was trying to break through. The banging grew louder, more frantic as the man threw himself against the door. The wood creaked under the strain, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I had to act fast. I grabbed the phone, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely dial. "There's a man in my basement," I stammered, my voice trembling with fear. "He's trying to break through the door. Please, send someone quickly." The operator assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity as I waited, the banging on the door growing more violent with each passing second. I backed away from the door, my eyes fixed on the wood as it began to splinter under the man's assault. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if the door gave way? What if he got through before the police arrived? But just as I was about to lose hope, the banging suddenly stopped. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe as I listened for any sign of movement on the other side of the door. But there was nothing. Slowly, I crept forward, my heart pounding in my chest as I pressed my ear against the door. I couldn't hear anything, no footsteps, no breathing, nothing. Had he given up? Had he gone back down to the basement? I wanted to believe that, but the fear in my gut told me otherwise. Something wasn't right. And then, without warning, the door burst open. The man lunged at me, his eyes wild with rage. I screamed, stumbling back as he grabbed at me, his fingers digging into my arms with a strength that belied his emaciated frame. We struggled, his breath hot against my face, his grip like iron. I tried to fight him off, tried to push him away, but he was relentless, his eyes locked onto mine with a madness that terrified me to my core. I could feel my strength waning, my vision blurring as he pinned me to the floor. His hands were around my throat, squeezing the life out of me, and I knew I didn't have much time left. But just as my vision started to fade, I heard it, the sound of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. The man hesitated, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air as I staggered away from him, and then the front door burst open, and the police were there, pulling him off me, dragging him away. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling with relief as I watched them haul him out of the house, his wild eyes still locked onto mine, that twisted smile still on his lips. The police stayed with me for hours, asking me questions, trying to piece together what had happened. I told them everything. The noises in the basement, the man under the blankets, the way he had attacked me. They searched the basement, combing through every inch of the space, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. No signs of how the man had gotten in, no evidence that he had been living there. The man was taken to a psychiatric facility, but I never learned who he was or where he had come from. The police told me he was a drifter, someone who had been living off the grid for years, moving from place to place. But that didn't explain why he had chosen my basement, why he had been hiding there. And I can only write this story after many years of therapy. If the police hadn't arrived in time, I wouldn't be here anymore. I was 10 years old when it happened, and it's a night I'll never forget. My parents had rushed to the hospital around midnight. My mom was in labor, and it was time for my little sister to be born. I remember the excitement and nervousness in the air as they scrambled to gather everything they needed. My mom was calm, but I could see the tension in my dad's face as he tried to keep things under control. Before they left, my dad knelt down to my level, placing his hands on my shoulders. "You're going to be fine, buddy," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. "We'll be back as soon as we can. Just stay inside, lock the doors, and don't answer the phone unless it's us. You're in charge, okay?" I nodded, trying to mirror his calmness. I wasn't scared, at least that's what I told myself. I was excited, actually. It was the first time I'd be home alone at night, and I felt grown up, ready to prove that I could handle it. As they drove off, I stood by the window, watching the taillights of their car fade into the darkness. The house felt different without them there. Bigger, emptier. But I wasn't afraid. I had my favorite movie queued up, a bag of chips, and a can of soda. It was going to be a fun night. Or so I thought. It was around 1 a.m. when I started to feel uneasy. The movie had just ended, and the house was dead silent. I remember thinking how strange it was that a house could feel so empty, so still, as if it was holding its breath. I got up to turn off the TV, the remote heavy in my hand. As I crossed the living room, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Movement, just outside the front door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a car driving by, the headlights casting shadows on the porch. But when I looked closer, I realized the shadow wasn't from a car, it was a person. I couldn't see them clearly, just the faint outline of a figure standing outside, barely visible through the frosted glass of the front door. They were tall, their shoulders hunched as if they were trying to stay out of sight. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Who could it be? My parents weren't supposed to be back yet, and they had the only other key. No one else knew I was home alone, at least no one who should have known. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the handle twist back and forth, the faint rattle of metal against metal filling the silence. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. I knew I had to hide, but where? My room felt too obvious, too easy to find. The closets were too small, too cramped, but there was one place I knew they wouldn't think to check: the hall closet. The hall closet was narrow, just wide enough for coats and shoes, with a small shelf above for storage. I had hidden there during hide-and-seek games with my friends before, and no one had ever found me. It was cramped, and the smell of old leather and mothballs filled the air, but it was my best option. I squeezed myself inside, pulling the door shut as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest so loud that I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible, my eyes fixed on the sliver of light that seeped through the crack in the door. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, my ears straining for any sound. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, thick and oppressive, like the whole world had stopped moving. I started to hope that maybe the person had left, that they had given up and walked away. But then I heard the creak of the front door opening. I bit down on my lip to keep from gasping, my body trembling with fear. The intruder was inside the house. The sound of footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, as if they were taking their time. The footsteps echoed through the hallway, growing louder as they approached the living room. I could hear the soft thud of something heavy being set down, followed by the faint rustle of fabric. Whoever it was, they weren't alone. I could hear low voices speaking in hushed tones, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. My mind raced with possibilities. Burglars? Kidnappers? Worse? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the terror that was threatening to overwhelm me. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly, afraid that even the slightest noise would give me away. And then the voices stopped. I opened my eyes, my breath hitching in my throat as I listened. The footsteps were moving again, this time heading down the hallway, toward me. The sound of footsteps grew closer, each step sending a jolt of fear through my body. I could see the shadow of someone moving just outside the closet door, their outline barely visible through the crack. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. But then the closet door began to open. I bit down on my lips so hard that I tasted blood, my heart hammering in my chest as the door creaked open, inch by inch. I tried to make myself as small as possible, pressing myself against the back wall, hoping that the darkness would hide me. The door stopped halfway open, and for a moment, nothing happened. I could hear the intruders breathing, slow and steady, just inches away from me. My mind raced with possibilities. What would they do if they found me? Would they hurt me? Worse? But then, the door suddenly slammed shut. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I could hear the intruder moving away, their footsteps retreating down the hallway. I stayed hidden, too scared to move, listening as the footsteps grew fainter and fainter, until finally they were gone. But I knew better than to come out. The intruders were still in the house, and I couldn't risk being seen. I could hear them moving around, opening drawers, rifling through cabinets, their voices low and tense. They were looking for something: money, valuables, anything they could take. I heard one of them curse under their breath, frustrated at not finding what they were looking for. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I wanted to cry, to scream, but I knew I had to stay quiet. I was alone, and no one was coming to help me. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the front door creak open again. The intruders were leaving. I stayed in the closet, my body trembling, waiting until I was sure they were gone. I didn't dare move until I heard the sound of a car engine starting outside, followed by the screech of tires on the pavement. And then, silence. I didn't come out of the closet right away. I was too scared, too shaken by what had just happened. I kept expecting the intruders to come back, to realize they had missed something, and return to finish what they had started. But they didn't. When I finally gathered the courage to leave my hiding place, the house was eerily quiet. The living room was a mess. Cushions thrown off the couch, drawers pulled out and emptied onto the floor, papers scattered everywhere. They had taken anything valuable they could find: jewelry, electronics, even the cash my parents kept in the kitchen drawer. I wandered through the house in a daze, the fear still gripping me, but a new emotion creeping in: anger. They had invaded my home, my safe place, and there was nothing I could do about it. I found the phone on the floor where they had tossed it after cutting the line. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, my voice barely steady as I told the operator what had happened. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the walls as they searched the house and took my statement. I told them everything I could remember: the shadows, the voices, the way they had searched the house like they knew exactly what they were looking for. But when it was all over and the police had left, I was alone again. The house felt different now, no longer a place of safety, but a place where bad things could happen. A place where strangers could walk right in and take whatever they wanted. My parents came home the next morning, exhausted but ecstatic after the birth of my sister. But their joy turned to horror when they saw the state of the house and heard what had happened. My dad held me tightly, his hands trembling as he apologized over and over for leaving me alone. My mom cried, her tears falling onto my hair as she hugged me. But the damage was done. The intruders were gone, and they had taken more than just our valuables. They had taken my sense of safety, my belief that my home was a place where nothing bad could happen. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow made me shiver with fear. I kept expecting the intruders to come back to finish what they had started, but they never did. It's a reminder that no place is truly safe. It was supposed to be a chill night. My parents had gone out for a dinner party, leaving me home alone for the first time in what felt like forever. I was a teenager, finally trusted enough to hold down the fort by myself, and I was looking forward to it. No siblings to bother me, no parents telling me to turn off the TV or do my homework. Just me, a bowl of popcorn, and hours of uninterrupted video games. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when everyone else is gone. It was comforting at first, a peaceful kind of silence that made the whole place feel like it was truly mine. I settled into my favorite spot on the couch, the game controller in hand, and lost myself in the pixelated world on the screen. But as the hours ticked by, that silence started to feel different. The clock on the wall ticked louder, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen became more pronounced, and every little noise of the house made me pause, my heart skipping a beat. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses make noise, and I was just being paranoid. Besides, I was having fun, and I wasn't about to let a few creaky floorboards ruin my night. But then, just as I was about to finish a particularly tough level, something caught my eye. Movement. Outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the game on the glass, a trick of the light that made it look like something was moving outside. But when I glanced over, I saw it clearly. A figure, sitting on the deck. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. The deck was right outside the living room window, visible from where I was sitting. But the figure was positioned so that I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body hunched over, almost as if they were waiting for something. I paused the game, my hands suddenly clammy around the controller. I squinted, trying to make out who it was. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a prank on me, or a neighbor who had wandered over. But then, as I watched, the figure turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of their face. It wasn't anyone I knew. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure was a man, older than me, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. He had short, dark hair and was wearing a plain hoodie, the hood pulled up to obscure most of his face, but what I could see was enough to send a chill down my spine. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile, but a wide, unsettling grin that stretched across his face, as if he found something incredibly amusing. His eyes were fixed on the house, but they didn't seem to focus on anything in particular. Just staring, unblinking. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. This wasn't normal. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't supposed to be here. I considered going outside, confronting him, but something held me back. There was something about the way he was sitting there, so still, so silent, that made me feel like I shouldn't get any closer. Instead, I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and moved to the window for a better look. The man didn't react, didn't even seem to notice me. He just kept staring ahead, that eerie grin never leaving his face. And then, he started to laugh. It was a strange laugh, barely audible through the glass, but I could see his shoulders shaking, his chest rising and falling with silent chuckles. There was no sound, just the movement, like he was laughing at a joke only he could hear. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This wasn't just some random guy, it was someone who clearly wasn't right in the head, and he was sitting on my deck, laughing to himself. I took a step back, my mind racing with what to do next. My parents weren't going to be home for hours, and I didn't want to call them and freak them out unless it was absolutely necessary. But I couldn't just ignore this either. I decided to lock the doors. At least that way, if he tried to come inside, he wouldn't be able to get in. I moved quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I locked the front door, then the back door, making sure every window was securely shut. The whole time I could feel the man's presence on the deck, that silent laughter echoing in my mind. But when I returned to the living room to check the sliding glass door that led to the deck, my heart nearly stopped. The man was standing right up against the glass, his face inches from the door. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table as I scrambled away from the door. The man was still grinning, his hands pressed flat against the glass, his breath fogging up the window. I could see him more clearly now, the pale, sickly tone of his skin, the dark circles under his eyes. And that grin, it was like he was enjoying this, like he knew exactly how terrified I was and was relishing every second of it. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to put as much distance between myself and that door as possible. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, his eyes tracking my every step. And then, without warning, he reached for the door handle. My breath hitched as I realized what he was trying to do. He was going to come inside. I bolted for the door, reaching it just as the handle started to turn. I yanked it back, locking it with trembling hands just as the man pulled on the handle from the other side. For a moment, we were face to face, separated only by the thin pane of glass. I could see the amusement in his eyes, the twisted pleasure he was getting out of this. He tugged on the door again, harder this time, but it held firm. I stepped back, my mind racing. What was he going to do next? Would he try to break the glass? Was he armed? I didn't know, and the uncertainty was almost worse than anything else. But then, to my surprise, the man let go of the handle. He stepped back, his grin widening as he tapped the glass with his finger, like he was playing some kind of game. And then he laughed again. A soundless, eerie laugh that made my skin crawl. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the panic I felt. I tried to explain what was happening, but my words came out in a rush, almost incoherent. There's a man on my deck, trying to get inside. He's just standing there, laughing. The operator assured me that the police were on their way, but it felt like an eternity before I heard the distant wail of sirens. I stayed on the phone, my eyes glued to the crack under the door, half expecting to see shadows moving outside. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if the man broke in before the police arrived? What if he wasn't alone? But then, just as I was about to lose hope, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps outside, followed by loud knocks on the front door. Police! Open up! I almost cried with relief. I unlocked my bedroom door and ran to the front door, throwing it open. 2 officers stood there, their faces serious, but the sight of them made me feel like I could finally breathe again. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, his voice calm but urgent. I nodded, still shaken. He was on the deck, trying to get inside. The officers exchanged a glance, then one of them motioned for me to stay inside while they checked the perimeter. I watched from the doorway as they moved around the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But when they returned, their expressions were grim. "We didn't find anyone," one of them said. "Are you sure he was out there?" I nodded, feeling a fresh wave of fear. He was right there, at the door. The officer sighed, glancing at his partner. We'll file a report and have someone keep an eye on the area tonight. But if you see anything else, anything at all, call us immediately." I nodded numbly, the reality of what had happened finally sinking in. The man was gone, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The police stayed for a while, making sure the house was secure and taking down my statement. They tried to reassure me, telling me it was probably just a vagrant or someone playing a prank, but I could see the concern in their eyes. When they finally left, I was alone again, the silence of the house now oppressive. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the living room, to face the sliding glass door where the man had been standing. Instead, I stayed in my room, every little noise making me jump. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grin, those dark, soulless eyes staring back at me. I kept imagining him coming back, finding a way inside, and what would happen if he did. When my parents finally came home in the early hours of the morning, I practically ran to them, blurting out everything that had happened. They were horrified, of course, but by then, it was too late. The man was gone, and there was nothing they could do. We called the police again, but they found no trace of him. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. It was like he had never been there at all. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I walked past the living room, I felt the urge to look out at the deck to make sure it was empty. I double-checked the locks on every door and window, never leaving anything to chance, but no matter what I did, I couldn't get that man's face out of my mind. That twisted grin, those silent laughs, it was like he had etched himself into my memory, a reminder that no matter how safe I thought I was, there was always something out there, waiting to find a way in. Even now, years later, I still get chills when I think about that night. I've moved on, tried to forget, but the fear lingers, a dark shadow that follows me wherever I go. I've already moved out of my parents' house, but sometimes, late at night, when I'm home alone and the house is silent, I can still feel him there, standing just outside the window, watching, waiting, laughing. If these stories made your heart race, don't forget to smash that like button and share the chills with your friends. Subscribe for more spine-tingling tales and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Got a terrifying Home Alone experience of your own? Drop it in the comments. We're dying to hear it. Remember, safety isn't guaranteed, especially when you're alone. Stay vigilant. See you in the next nightmare.